Welcome to Unlocking Bach, audio program notes for upcoming concerts in Music Worcester's The Complete Bach. I'm Artistic Director Dr. Chris Shepard. Join me as we climb into the miraculous mind of Johann Sebastian Bach. Hello and welcome to this episode of Unlocking Bach. In this episode, I want to look at the two secular cantatas, that is, not cantatas for the church, but cantatas outside the church, that the Worcester Chorus will be singing under my direction on Saturday afternoon. This is BWV 213 and 214. It's actually easy to know which cantatas are secular because they are the ones that begin with the number 2. All of the sacred ones go up to 199, and then they use 200 to number the secular cantatas, and there are not all that many of them. They're a little bit complicated to understand his output with these cantatas. And let me explain what they are and why it's a little complicated. If there is any music that we are slightly embarrassed by in the output of Johann Sebastian Bach, you say, how could you ever be embarrassed? Well, we're never embarrassed about the music itself. But it is the libretti of these cantatas. It is the words that were written that can be awfully embarrassing, and this is the reason. These cantatas, more often than not, were command performances. They were written for birthdays of royalty, and those words, as you'll see in a moment, can be embarrassing in the sense that they are just so over the top in terms of being a sycophant and sucking up to your boss. We don't like to think of Johann Sebastian Bach like that, but you've got to remember, in this era, all of these wonderful composers worked within what is now known as the patronage system. They could not have made a living just writing music and selling it. That just did not exist as a construct until the beginning of the 19th century. In fact, we tend to think of Beethoven as the first great composer who made a living without being employed by a patron. But even then, he needed patrons to commission the works. So get out of your mind anything associated with the idea of a composer just working away up in their turret and then selling those scores. No, the way to survive was to be employed either by the church or by a court. And in Bach's life, he was employed by both. And of course, because the church and the state were enmeshed in this period, whether it was the Roman Catholic Church or it was the Lutheran Church, what that really meant was that each of his jobs combined working for a court and working for a church. Now, I've written about and spoken a little bit about the situation in Leipzig, which was not exactly what was known as a free city, but it did act quite like a free city. It reported to the Elector of Saxony, who was based in Dresden. This post was one of those electors, quite literally, who elected the Holy Roman Empire. So it was quite important. This was a prince. In the case of the Elector of Saxony, they might have been dukes, they were princes, sometimes they were kings. That didn't matter so much as their role as being really important. And you might think of it a little bit as the relationship between the Pope and the cardinals. The cardinals, of course, report to the Pope, but they also elect the new Pope. So it was important in that sense. And in Leipzig, they were very proud of their quasi-independence. And it's why the town council was so powerful and in some ways such a difficult boss for Bach, because they guarded their own prerogative very carefully. However, they did come under the sway of the Elector of Saxony. So whenever any of the royalty were going to be visiting, there would have been some sort of celebration, some kind of ceremony, and often Bach would have been required to write a cantata with secular words, usually in praise, sometimes, in fact, I could even say often, in sort of cringing praise of the royalty. And you wonder on some level, would he have been embarrassed himself to write all this? I don't think so. Think about the flowery language that people would sign their letters when they would write to their boss or the local nobility, your humble and obedient servant. I just think that that was part of the ethos of the period. And he who pays the piper names the tune. And Bach knew certainly who he was working for. And in fact, there's a little bit of a twist. Since he did not get along with his bosses, his direct bosses in Leipzig, he went over their heads in 1733 when the new Elector of Saxony was coming into office, and he submitted the first hour of his B minor Mass as a job application because he wanted to be appointed court composer. And in fact, the two cantatas that we will be performing are from the same period. This was right after Augustus the Strong had died in 1733, and his son, Augustus III, was assuming office. All of this was happening in 1733, and you might wonder, how did Bach have all sorts of time to do this composition? Well, there wouldn't have been normal church cantatas during this period of mourning. There would have been very little music making in Leipzig. So he had a chance to put together the Kyrie and Gloria of the B minor Mass as a job application and to write these two rather extensive, they're about half an hour each, secular cantatas. One is for the new princess and the other is for the new crown prince. And they really are just simply works that extol the virtues of Electress Maria Josepha of Saxony and the Crown Prince Friedrich Christian. What is important about these pieces, however, is not the pieces themselves, 213 and 214. Here is the really interesting and quite significant thing about a number of the secular cantatas. And I had said before, it's a little unclear. They have not all come down to us in their pure forms. And the reason is that even as Bach was writing them, he knew that these pieces were too ephemeral. They were attached to one event. And as we know about the sacred church cantatas, he wrote these cantatas to be used over and over again through his time in Leipzig. So we know that he was somebody who took care of his music and made it performable in different ways. He was an active working composer and he wanted to be as efficient as possible. So he would reuse the secular cantatas. Sometimes that meant that he would write a cantata for the birthday of a member of the nobility or a member of the royal household, and then later would use the exact same cantata with the words changed to celebrate the birthday of, for example, a professor at the University of Leipzig. So keeping them straight is a little complicated. The other thing that's complicated is that often the libretto, which was sometimes printed, was published, the libretto survived, but the music didn't survive. And then finally, and here's the transition to today's Unlocking Bach, the other thing that is most significant about the secular cantatas is that Bach would often reuse the music for an entirely different kind of piece, not just another congratulatory or celebratory secular cantata, but for a sacred reason. And we even have the sense that as he was composing the secular cantata, he may have had in mind the sacred use for later. These two secular cantatas, PWV 213, which was written for the 11th birthday of the Crown Prince, and 214, which was written for the birthday of the new Electress, he reused the material from these two cantatas to a large extent when he composed his Christmas oratorio later in the year. And there are even musicologists that suspect that he had that in mind even as he was writing this music. So what we're going to do today is to look at three movements, and there are at least 7 movements that he reused. In fact, it's more than that because the opening chorus from each of these two cantatas he reused as choruses in the Christmas oratorio, but then another slew of arias. And they are used almost exactly verbatim. That the instrumental music is almost exactly the same. Sometimes he would use a different instrument because he would rewrite it for a different range, like maybe a soprano sang it in the secular cantata, but an alto will sing it in the Christmas oratorio. But for each of those arias, it's the exact same number of measures, for example, and he only would rework the vocal line when the text required it. So it is easy to imagine that as he was writing these pieces that he knew would only be performed once, at the same time, he was thinking of how to use it for Christmas. So let's look at that. Let me just very quickly say how he structured these two. BWV 214, which is the cantata for the Electress Maria Josepha, he used three goddesses. And for many of these secular cantatas, there will be classical allusions, either to Latin or to Greek mythology or to the stories or to the traditions, because this was an era in which neoclassical scholarship was really flourishing. So he used for the Electress and her birthday three goddesses: the goddess of war, the goddess of wisdom, and the goddess of fame. For the crown prince, he uses you might even say tortured, it feels tortured at some points. I just have to say that the libretto for this just goes a bit far. It uses Hercules and his battle between choosing vice and choosing virtue, so that all of the arias are either sung by virtue or by vice. And you might think of them as the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder arguing over Hercules. And Hercules, of course, makes the right choice in the end. And the allegory is to suggest that the crown prince, Friedrich Christian, will himself, as he comes of age, he's only 11 years old at this point, will also need to learn which one to choose, but we have faith that he will choose virtue in the end. So those are the large structures of the libretti for these two cantatas. But now let's just take a moment. We're going to look at three different movements, one chorus and two arias from the two different cantatas, and see how did Bach later transform those to become the Christmas oratorio. In order to do that, let me just teach you one more expression. This is not an expression from the Baroque period, it comes from later, but we use it extensively when we talk about Baroque music, and that is this: the doctrine of affects, or the doctrine of affections, it is sometimes translated too. In German, the word is A-F-F-E-K-T, affect. And it is, as you might imagine, it has to do with how we are affected by the music. But there's a twist in Baroque music. The sense is this, that the music doesn't just embody the emotion that it's trying to elicit, but it elicits in the listener the exact emotion. It's not cerebral, it is emotional and quasi-physical. That's really important to understand, because when he would then transfer a movement from one set of text for a secular cantata to, say, the Christmas oratorio, he has to elicit in the listener the same emotion. So the texts have to match in that sense. This process, when a composer takes a pre-written composition that he or even sometimes another composer wrote, transforms it to a new composition, is called parody. Now that word only exists today in something like Saturday Night Live, that a parody is a funny version, a funny takeoff on something. In this period, the word parody was not associated with comedy. It was just simply like the original. So let's look at a couple of those. Let's begin with BWV 214. This is the one for the Queen, and it begins with this text: "Sound, you drums, ring forth, trumpets, vibrating strings, fill the air, now sing songs, you exuberant poets." It goes on, to say that the songs that we're going to sing will be in praise of the Queen. Long live the Queen. So what does he do for this? When the choir finally sings the extended line, it sounds like this. Tönet ihr Pauken, erschallet Trompeten, klingende Saiten, erfüllet die Luft. And you can tell right from the beginning it has a very dance-like, very celebratory in that sense. And all the instruments, drums, trumpets, strings, and singing. So why wouldn't he begin with drums? He does, and I've been trying to think. I can't think of another movement that begins with a drum solo, timpani. This is what the timpani does. Bum, 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 bum. And only after that does the fanfare of the trumpets enter. And I love it because we get all of the things. We get the drums. Sound you drums. Ring forth trumpets. Then vibrating strings. How do the strings vibrate? Well, this is crazy writing, and I will not play it very well, but you'll get the idea. They do this. Just these incredibly fast, fiery scales. So that is certainly the vibrating strings filling the air. And then when we have the now sing songs, you exuberant poets, you get that beautiful vocal sound. So then the question is, what does Bach do to open the Christmas oratorio? Because he uses this exact same material. He does not, however, have any of the instruments named. The text is, and remember what I said, that the instrumentation and the orchestral material is the exact same in the Christmas oratorio as it had been in the secular cantata. So the text is, celebrate, rejoice, rise up and praise these days, glorify what the highest has done today. Abandon despair, banish laments, sound forth full of delight and happiness, serve the highest with glorious choruses, let us honor the name of the supreme ruler. So what has happened is that the royalty that he is exalting is no longer the electress, the princess, but is God the King. And without naming any instruments, he is saying, let's do all these things that the instruments were doing, the celebrating, the rejoicing, the rising up, the praising. And he does say, serve the highest with glorious choruses. So it doesn't matter what the text is that the choir sings in the Christmas oratorio. What is embedded in the material is the sounding of the drums, the ringing forth of the trumpets, the vibrating strings filling the air. I've conducted the Christmas oratorio a number of times, and I really welcome the chance to conduct, as it were, the pure version of it, to conduct this cantata where you understand, why does he begin with timpani? Why does he begin with timpani? Because the original one says, sound you drums. And that is what you need to understand in studying parody movements with Bach, is that the original is embedded in it, but it has a different role. Now let's look at two of the arias that we find in these, and we'll stay with cantata number 214, remembering that this is the one for the princess. This is the 7th movement, and it is an aria sung by the bass. And this is for trumpet and strings, not terribly common, I should say, a trumpet solo aria. There are some, but they're not particularly numerous in Bach's output. Let me just play the beginning of this. So it's definitely really rousing, isn't it? And that the trumpet, straightforward and then syncopated. And even the left hand is really very interesting. Have a listen to this. has real verve to it. The strings are very syncopated. And when the bass comes in, it's all that material from the beginning. Kron und Preis, gekrönte Damen, Königin mit deinen Namen. You get these little trumpet fanfares. The text, crown and trophy of royal ladies queen, with your name I flood the entire world. And it has this great sense of celebration and praise. What does he do in the Christmas oratorio? Well, here he is referring to kingship. And I should say, by the way, trumpet often in the music of Johann Sebastian Bach is a reference to kingship. This comes from the French tradition of Louis XIV, Louis XIV at Versailles, the tradition of the trumpet fanfare in the music of that court by people like Charpentier and Lully and Rameau, that they would use within the orchestra trumpets to represent the king. So D major, which is the key of Bach's trumpet and timpani pieces, right from the get-go will be associated with royalty. So there, again, this pretty anodyne text, isn't it? It's sycophantic and just saying, oh, queen, you're wonderful, which is what you would write when you're writing a celebratory cantata for members of the royalty. But listen to what happens when we no longer talk about this queen, Maria Josepha, but about the ruler of heaven and earth. Great Lord, O powerful King. So far, so good, right? That trumpet D major. So far, so good. Very much about God the King. But there is a sting in the tail. It goes on to say, dearest Savior, oh, how little you care about the glories of the earth. He who sustains the entire world, who created its magnificence and beauty, must sleep in a harsh manger. It's quite a twist, isn't it? That the original in the secular cantata is only about the glory of the queen. And even this text that says, with your name I flood the entire world, that idea in the Christmas oratorio, he who sustains the entire world. So that text is still in there, but with the twist that the maker of heaven and earth, the king of everything, he comes down rejecting pomp for the manger. But it embodies the pomp. Even so. Now I want to show you something that you're going to see in a second. Because you've got to remember, when you're dealing with somebody as incredibly intelligent as Bach, it would have been very possible for him to write these movements with both works in mind at the same time, maybe even making notes to himself as he went. So remember I said this is quite syncopated? And that bass part, I want you to remember that idea, which is rocking back and forth a little bit. Because now we are going to turn to the third movement that I want to look at in this episode, which is from the other cantata. This is 213. It's the third movement, keeping in mind that this is the cantata for the Crown Prince, using Hercules as an avatar for somebody who needs to choose ultimately between vice and virtue. So the text, which is sung by Vice, this is really interesting because it's a very beautiful movement. Let me just play a bit of it. It's very beautiful, isn't it? And when the alto when the soprano comes in, because I get this mixed up, because in the Christmas oratorio, it's a very famous aria sung by an alto instead. When the soprano comes in, she holds a long note on the word schlafe, to sleep. She's holding these long notes, the sustenance of sleep. But it is a funny text for this one. In the original, sleep, my beloved, and cultivate ease. Follow the enticement of passionate thoughts. So this time there's a sting in the tail, but it's in the secular one. In the beginning it just say, be restful, take your ease, but it's actually Vice trying to tempt Hercules. Taste the delight of a sensual nature and own no bounds to it. It's like Satan tempting Jesus in the desert and saying, you could have all of this. That Vice is saying to this prince, you could have all of this belongs to you, so just enjoy it, enjoy the sensual pleasures of life. And then of course, virtue comes in later to say, no, don't do that. Well, what happens in the Christmas oratorio is that the alto sings this to the baby Jesus. Sleep, my beloved, enjoy your rest, and awaken after it for all the fortunate. Refresh your breast, experience the joy that delights our hearts. It is the purest form of the idea that something secular, something worldly, is transformed through parody into something sacred, something religious. I really love that idea. But it's the same idea. It's that music. Like I say, it uses the same music. But remember how I showed you that we had ba be ba be da ba da ba, those octaves going back and forth, sort of rocking? Well, here they really rock. Up, down, down, up, down. And becomes the rocking of a cradle, putting the infant Jesus to sleep. It's not quite the same for the 11-year-old crown prince. I mean, it certainly is redolent of sleep. But in the Christmas oratorio, you can imagine that he had it in mind, because it's exactly that. And we find, in fact, in other movements in the sacred cantatas, when he wants to suggest the rocking of a cradle, he will use that sort of a figure. And so then, and this is unknowable, but do you remember how that great king that was originally to extol the virtues of the princess becomes great Lord, O powerful king, but he who sustains the entire world must sleep in a harsh manger? I wonder, because it's the same pattern, I wonder if Bach is implanting the idea of the crib then, even when he wrote it for the secular cantata. That's what blows my mind in parody with the music of Bach, is how often did he retrofit and how often did he plan to have this music be reusable. I think you're going to love this concert. I really encourage you to come to it, because this is wonderful music. The thing about the music for the secular cantatas is that it is generally more accessible, more joyful, prettier, because it's not as theologically thorny as the sacred cantatas can often be. So it's just wonderful music. And it's really rare to hear these pieces performed in their original format, because they have such a long and rich life in the Christmas oratorio. It's very interesting to hear their origin. So I look forward to seeing you at that concert, and I look forward, as always, to seeing you again here on the podcast, where we will continue to explore the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Thank you so much.